Why the Americans were so feared by the Japanese. Well, let's get into it, baby.
The cliffs of Saipan were never meant to echo with screams. But in July 1944, American soldiers stood frozen as whole Japanese families stepped towards the island's rocky edges. Some clung to one another, some prayed, many just wept, and then, one after another, they jumped. For many civilians, it was the final order that they would ever receive. Japanese soldiers had told them that the Americans would torture them. Propaganda had shown the Americans as demons with claws and fangs. Surrender was described as worse than death. 5-year-old Koyushiroma remembered his father's desperate warning. The Americans will kill you. You must die yourself. Moments later, Koyu followed the crowd and leapt, but survived because his clothing snagged on a branch. This horror wasn't an isolated incident. Similar scenes unfolded on Tinian, on Saipan, and later on a massive scale at
So they
Okinawa.
really described American soldiers as being like the devil almost. Yeah, that's pretty terrifying. I can't lie.
Behind
It's pretty
all of
terrifying.
it was the same driving force: fear. Fear built over years of propaganda, fear hardened by battlefield experience, and fear fueled by a realization that the enemy Japan once mocked might in fact be unstoppable. So here's the question directly. Did the Japanese truly fear the Americans during World War II? Long before Pearl Harbor, Japanese perceptions of the Americans were shaped by resentment and cultural friction. The United States had imposed severe economic sanctions in response to Japan's wars in China and its expansion into French Indochina. These embargoes, especially on oil, threatened Japan's entire war machine. To many Japanese citizens, this American position looked deliberately
cool with Japan
hostile and
nowadays,
humiliating. Propaganda
not so much
reinforced
with
this.
that craziness
Americans
of an
were
office,
portrayed
but
as weak,
think America and
individualistic, and
Japan are
lacking
good
any
now.
form of Bushido, the warrior spirit that Japanese ideology prized above all else. The West was decadent, lazy, and spiritually empty. Technically advanced, sure, but fundamentally soft. To a society steeped in martial culture, this distinction mattered. Japan believed its collective discipline and willingness to sacrifice would triumph over America's material abundance. In short,
I
before the
do
war,
love their
many
culture, you
Japanese
know what I'm
looked
saying?
down
They
on the
all stick to it,
Americans.
and you know what
They
I'm saying?
didn't fear them. Once war broke out, Japanese units gained first-hand experience fighting Americans in places like Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. Their reports reveal a complex picture. On one hand, American infantrymen were noted to be skilled riflemen, capable grenade users, and usually supported by extraordinary artillery fire. The Japanese were struck by how quickly American forces adapted, how well they used combined arms, and how effectively they leveraged their industrial might. But the early assessments still echoed pre-war arrogance. Japanese officers wrote that the Americans lacked initiative, scouted poorly, and were overly dependent on firepower.
So they
Supply dumps
underscouted
were
them.
described
They
as
thought we were trash.
extravagant, which reinforced the belief that Americans were spoiled and soft. At this stage, the Japanese saw their enemy as capable, but still inferior in spirit. That perception wouldn't
That shit
last.
pissed
By
me
late
off a little bit, I can't
1943, something changed. Despite heavy casualties, American forces kept pushing forward. The U.S. Navy replaced sunk ships at staggering speed. Lost aircraft were replaced in greater numbers. Infantry divisions rotated fresh troops into battle, while Japan's ranks grew thinner and younger. For Japanese soldiers, this was unnerving. The American industrial base, immense, distant, and untouchable, was an enemy of its own. Diaries and interrogations reveal comments like, "They never stop coming. Their ships return faster than we can sink them. It's like fighting the tide." This was the beginning of genuine fear, not of American courage, but of American inevitability. As the Pacific Campaign
we just
intensified, one group in
We just kept
particular came
going
to
and going
symbolize
and going
American
and going and
ferocity,
going,
the
no matter
U.S.
what.
Marine Corps. From Guadalcanal onward, Marines earned a reputation
never
as
what?
relentless assault troops. Japanese propaganda amplified this reputation, portraying Marines as inhuman barbarians, murderers, sadists, and even criminals recruited from prisons. Absurd rumors circulated
wouldn't be
claiming
surprised if they
Marines
did
were
that.
forced to kill their own families to prove their loyalty. Wild? Yeah, but effective. Many Japanese soldiers came to believe that to surrender to the Marines was equivalent to torture or execution. Civilians absorbed this belief too,
which we found
setting
out
the stage
it was.
for the mass suicides
That's
that
what they were
would
doing,
shock
man.
American troops in
That's what we were doing,
1944 and 45. Time the American forces had reached Saipan, fear among the Japanese population had hit its peak. After brutal fighting and a final desperate banzai charge, Japanese defenders were shattered. The civilians, conditioned for years to believe that the Americans were monsters, now faced what they believe was their fate. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000,
And they jumped
chose
off
suicide.
cliffs, bro. They
Journal
jumped
entries
off
from
the
American
cliffs.
soldiers
They were
described
so
the
scared.
scenes in disbelief. Entire families walking calmly to the edge, bowing towards the sea, and jumping hand in hand. U.S. troops tried to shout assurances, even posted Japanese-speaking interpreters, but to little effect. Fear had replaced reason. Of Saipan's roughly 20,000 civilians, as many as 13,000 died during the battle, though exact numbers are difficult to verify. This tragedy made one thing undeniable. Japan's wartime propaganda had succeeded far too well. Several factors
little too much,
reinforced
huh, buddy?
Japanese terror as the war continued. One were feigned surrenders and brutal close quarters fighting. Japanese soldiers often pretended to surrender before detonating grenades or using knives at point-blank range. U.S. medics, often moving unarmed to treat wounded men, were killed this way. American troops learned not to trust surrender gestures, which led to legitimate surrenders sometimes being met with preemptive gunfire.
Yeah, they're just gonna
To
shoot 'em
Japanese
dead after that.
observers, this looked like proof of American savagery. 2. The trophy taking. While not widespread, the taking of skulls, teeth, and ears by some American servicemen horrified both the Japanese and the American High Command, which eventually issued strict prohibitions. Japanese civilians and soldiers often heard rumors, some true, most exaggerated, that Americans collected body parts as trophies. Given the climate of mutual dehumanization, these stories spread rapidly. Once the media and newspapers got a hold of them, they became yet another reason surrender seemed impossible. 3 was the American firepower. Perhaps nothing provoked
to them,
more
like,
dread
even,
than
like,
American
surrendering
artillery
wasn't
and
good
naval
enough.
bombardment. Japanese
us,
diaries frequently mention
like, what they
the
would thought,
earth-shaking
no
power
matter
of U.S.
what,
naval
was
guns,
we were just gonna
nighttime
wipe out
bombardments
Japan
that made
and
sleep
everything.
impossible, and
Not
shells
just the
that
soldiers,
fell
everything.
endlessly. To soldiers that were raised to believe in spirit over machinery, this display of overwhelming industrial power was psychologically crushing. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a feedback loop of terror. Japan taught its people that Americans were monsters. Japanese soldiers acted in ways that hardened Americans into distrust. American responses confirmed Japanese fears, which in turn justified more resistance and more brutality. Neither side saw the other as fully human anymore. Okinawa, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, was the last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Between 100 and 150,000 civilians died, many caught between the two armies, many more pressed into forced labor, and thousands encouraged or coerced to commit suicide rather than surrender. When the U.S. planners studied Okinawa's casualty rates, they concluded that an invasion of Japan itself might kill millions, both Allied and Japanese. The Japanese government, meanwhile, broadcast increasingly desperate propaganda, urging civilians to resist to the death, warning again that Americans would commit atrocities against anyone who surrendered. Fear had consumed the home islands. And yet, when American forces finally occupied Japan after its surrender, many civilians were shocked to be treated with professionalism and restraint, proof that wartime propaganda had shaped a distorted image on both sides. Did the Japanese fear the Americans?
Yeah,
The
they
answer
were
is
probably
unquestionably
horrified, bro.
Yes,
And you can't
but
blame them,
not
bro.
in a simple
Like, the
way.
propaganda
At the start of the
in
war,
all
the
countries, in the
Japanese
United
mocked
States, is
Americans
just so
as
bad.
soft and undisciplined.
You
On
won't
the
know until you
battlefield,
see
they
it
came
for
to
yourself,
respect
bro.
American
That's what I
firepower
always say.
and adaptability. As
Don't
defeat became
trust what
inevitable,
anybody
that
says. Go
respect
see it
turned
for
into fear
yourself,
of
gang.
American strength, of American brutality, and of propaganda-fed nightmares that convinced thousands.
That's crazy. They
that death
all
was preferable to
13,000
capture.
people,
In the end,
and probably a
fear
lot of
shaped
them
how
jumped
the Pacific
off the
War
whole
was
the
fought,
mountain.
how civilians behaved,
That's
and how
insane.
millions understood their enemy. It
Or maybe that number
magnified
was, if it was
brutality,
13,000
fueled
people jumped
resolve,
off,
and
that means they were
contributed
jumping
to
for a while.
tragedies
That's
that still
horrible to
haunt the
see.
memory of the war today.
That's horrible, bro. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you watch the other ones because they're just like this. And make sure you hit the like button and the sub button because we're on our way to 100K. It's going to happen by the end of this year. Mark my words. I promise you it will happen. We will have that silver play button in a heartbeat. But let's get into the next video.